Hello and welcome back to Coffee and Kurosawa, where a film obsessive sits down with a film fan to talk about film. I am Ben Filipkowski, your resident film obsessive.
And I am Farrah Sarpkaya, a person who loves film, but like in a super chill, it's a hot Saturday and I want to sit in a cold theater and be entertained kind of way.
And today we are talking about the incredible, the original, the iconic Star Wars, Episode 4, A New Hope, originally known just as Star Wars on its release. Yes, today we're trying to make the podcast equivalent of the Kessel Run in less than 12 parsecs by keeping this conversation to roughly an hour. We hope the Force will be with us as we join Mark Hamill, Carrie Fisher, Harrison Ford, and Peter Mayhew on the Millennium Falcon. As always, if you don't want to be spoiled, please go watch the movie. We'll be here waiting when you get back. We'll also likely mention spoilers from other Star Wars properties, so blanket statement in true Canadian fashion. We're sorry. As we discuss this movie, be aware that it features scenes of sci-fi violence and mild language. At the time of its release, Star Wars was rated PG. So, from my perspective, a little bit of background, I love Star Wars almost in spite of Star Wars at this point. And we're going to be digging into that feeling a bit more. But I've also seen this more times than I can count. So, before we really dig into the nitty-gritty of things, Farrah, I know this was only your third time watching it. What did you think?
Yeah, so I was a Star Trek kid, and as the joke goes, you're either one or the other. The first time I watched Star Wars, I was 16 with a boy I liked, because I am a cliche. The second time was in my mid-20s, whenever the latest trilogy began, and we watched all 6 so that I'd have context. I had to think about that for a second, because there's so many now. I've seen a handful of new series, like Bad Batch, Mandalorian, Ashoka. I've watched Clone Wars, most of the new movies. I've played the TTRPGs. I've read some of the books. And all that to say, I'm not really sure why Star Wars never gripped me the same as Star Trek or, other series. But watching it again now, like the original movie, it really was just a fun romp with yet another incredible John Williams score. I loved that Luke didn't feel like the hero. He was the main character, but the rest of the cast didn't feel like just companions, to borrow a Doctor Whoism. They were not just the Watsons to his Sherlock. I also kind of super forgot that the twist isn't in this movie, which threw me off, because, honestly, when it comes to these movies, it's really hard for me to remember where one starts and another ends, because there's just so much of it. So it was weird to think of the plot of this film and the relationships without the context of everything we learn about Luke and Leia later on. And with, every other person that watches this probably has that context too. And I think overall, the biggest thing for me was thinking about it as a standalone movie was so hard. Because, there is so much media that's come out since then. They even renamed it to keep it within context of the real world and where it fit in there. And so I kept having to remind myself that, the dozen movies, the TV shows, the video games, the TTRPGs, the books, the everything else that exists in the lore now, this was just a scrappy little space movie. And it started this incredible phenomenon that we cannot escape. So as we dive into this conversational segment, I think we're going to kick off with, how do we even watch this movie with all of that context around us, but just thinking of it as a movie by itself?
Yeah, that is a challenge. On the one hand, nothing exists in a pure vacuum. The idea of film criticism, of literary criticism in general, is that everything kind of exists in a conversation with the world around it. And with Star Wars, for me, I can't forget about the wider Star Wars universe. That's a problem. I think I was saying to you before we started recording that I was geeking out a little bit watching this again. I haven't watched it in a couple of years, and recognizing characters from that expanded universe of all things Star Wars and going well, he's in this show. It's a problem for me.
That's funny you say that, because my husband and I were watching it last night to prepare for this, and throughout the thing, he's because he's a fan, he was like, hey, just if you have questions while we're watching it, just let me know. So throughout I was like, okay, if we're thinking about the lore and the timeline, I recognize that guy because they brought him back to life in real world with AI as a general or something, right? And then in another one, it was like, oh, that's Boba Fett. I recognize him from the thing. Or he's a Mandalorian. Oh my God. And they don't talk about any of that stuff in the movie. But I
Yeah.
just know because I've watched all the other stuff, and it was so weird to like be like, no, I can't think about that. Like, I kept thinking of the scenes that I've seen in other movies
Yeah.
and being like, oh wait, that's not here. That's somewhere else.
Yeah.
And having to rewrite it in my head.
Yeah, and I think like that's something that we're gonna definitely dig into a little later on. But that idea that like it just pulls you in, almost despite yourself.
Yeah.
A very similar experience for me watching it the other night. I was determined I'm going to take such good notes. I'm going to focus on just things like shot composition. I'm going to focus on references to other movies. And I very quickly put my laptop down and was just like, "Oh yay, lasers go pew pew."
Oh boy, Star Wars.
Yeah. Oh boy, a Star Wars. So yeah, it's tricky. It's tough. But I did try and have that like general sort of perspective on this, and I was able to spot a few things. They're not really sticking out at the same time. It's tough to talk. It is for sure tough to talk about this movie removed from the wider context. The lore that you get in this movie is just that opening crawl.
Yeah.
And when it was first released, there's no subtitle, there's no episode 4 attached to it. It's just Star Wars. Here's your plot.
Yeah.
Go have fun.
Star Wars, period. Full stop.
Yeah.
Do not pass go.
Yeah.
But then collect multiple billions of dollars.
All the money.
Yeah, it's funny because like the last 2 episodes that we've talked about, The Godfather and Jaws, you were giving me close readings of like, oh, Spielberg did this with the visualization. Oh, do you see how they did this long shot? Let's talk about that for like 20 minutes. And this time when we got on the call, you were like, Star Wars.
Yeah.
Oh my God. Iconic. And I was like, okay, but where's that other stuff?
Yeah.
And I love that.
Yeah.
One thing I will say though is speaking of context, the thing you pointed out to me the most is how much of a close conversation this is with stuff that came before.
Yeah.
'Cause like I don't know this because I'm not in all of I don't watch all of the things, but you referenced the fact that this talks about or speaks to, I don't know,
Yeah.
a bunch of other movies that came before Star Wars. So tell me more about that.
Yeah.
I want to know.
For sure. Yeah, so I think it's no real secret that George Lucas, in creating this movie, was so heavily inspired by things like Flash Gordon serials. I think it's Buck Rogers' Adventures Across the 25th Century. I can't remember the name properly. I'm sure I'm getting something wrong there. But he was really heavily inspired by like classic pulp storytelling of his youth. And so making Star Wars, a lot of that gets wrapped up and incorporated into this. But simultaneously, beyond those more aesthetic influences, genre influences, I should say, the more overt, like, we're pulling tropes from these things. This also really pulls in a bunch of influence from filmmakers that influenced Lucas. He goes to a film school in California. He's best buds with Marty Scorsese and Steven Spielberg. All 3 of them look up to Francis Ford Coppola, and they're all making their student films and such. Lucas has this focus on kind of like the big picture. He's great at executing a big vision and doing kind of more effects-driven stuff. He's a little more ambitious in that sense. But his language of film is kind of like, my note here, and this is reductive, I don't mean it to be, but it's like,
How dare
it screams, I really like Akira Kurosawa. And hey, I don't blame him. I love Akira Kurosawa as well. That kind of stuck out to me a little bit more, that watching this again with, a few more years of digging into film on my end as a total film geek and obsessive, there's such a referentiality to the shot composition and kind of structuring that Akira Kurosawa did. It's not as stylized, it's not as fluid or fluent in that kind of filmic language, but it's there. There are a few sequences of kind of unnatural blocking, structure and layout, how people are arranged in a shot that make it a little more exciting, a little more dramatic. And I'm thinking particularly of like Han and Luke in the Death Star control room when Luke's trying to convince Han, we gotta go rescue the princess.
Right.
Because, like, he's kind of, Han's looking over his shoulder, but he's still looking at the camera. Luke's kind of moving back and forth to kind of create that more dynamic structure, and we get those cuts to Chewie just being Chewie and reacting. Watching it now, I see a lot of that Kurosawa influence, a lot of that kind of Japanese cinema, samurai cinema influence. It's not as overt as, and this is my problem, it's not as overt as later Star Wars media would get with those references. It's a little more subtle. It's drawing from the language. It's not just quoting it, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So I studied English and religion in university. So for me, when you're talking about referential, when you're talking about, paying homage to certain, in my case, writers, um, I always try to think about this film context, and the same can be said of art or any other, creative field of what does that look like in practice? So you gave us the example of the that scene with Han and Luke, right? What I struggle sometimes to think about how and why and to what effect he would be doing this. You know what I mean? Like in obviously, like in literature, we're doing references to maybe give some additional context into the thoughts and feelings of the characters, or produce a specific vibe that we're going for, to borrow the parlance of the youth. But when it comes to something like this, which is just like, I say just, but it's just a space romp. It's just a fun little adventure. Why and what is the outcome that someone like George Lucas, some director, is going for? Like, one thing that we brought up earlier is being able to make high art accessible. Does that wrap into this in any way?
I think it does to some extent. I don't know if it's necessarily a stated goal of Lucas's to sneak in all these references to quote unquote high art, to quote unquote serious cultural stuff. But I think he's doing it because he likes it, he loves it, he has a passion for it. And it's cool when we see those passions come to life on the screen. In particular, Lucas is a devotee of Joseph Campbell's Hero of a Thousand Faces, which is a bit more of like a philosophical text about storytelling, about the concept of the hero's journey, which, you kind of see in most westernized storytelling these days. So I think he's referencing these things as maybe not to directly tie into that idea of the hero's journey, the monomyth, but like to get into this, you're using idioms that people might be familiar with, even if they don't know where it's from. You're using those things to help convey a story, to help tell a story, and to draw people in to create that sense of narrative purpose almost.
Yeah, so I love the fact that this film really dives into those 12 steps. So, like, you can literally, like, map Star Wars to the call to adventure, the refusal of the call, meeting the mentor, and, all these things. And not just for Luke. And that delights me. And the fact that Luke is not the only hero in this film that goes through that hero's journey is very cool to me. Because, like, again, as a standalone film, trying to forget that all of the other Star Wars exists in the universe, all we have is this scrappy little kid from this dusty planet, or sandy planet, I guess, who suddenly acquires these droids, and he sees a pretty girl on a projector and is like, oh, she's cute. And then the droid runs away, and he meets a wizard in the dunes of the sand planet that he's from. And then his family dies, and he's like, okay, well, I guess I'm going to go on an adventure now.
Yeah.
But we also see C-3PO and R2-D2 have their own little hero's journey. And then Han Solo, when he's got the call to action later on, has the hero's journey.
Yeah.
And it's just, this layering effect is so cool.
Yeah.
And really, I wonder, speaks to that connection that we all have with it. I'm kind of deviating and jumping a little ahead in our bullet points here, but
No, yeah,
the
it's
yeah.
definitely there. Yeah, like Han as a character is so fun in this movie because he has this. He's a bit of an amoral mercenary when we first meet him. You know, I guess
bit.
he's got a code of conduct, but by the end, like you're cheering as he comes in to
Yeah.
help save Luke and save the day.
Mhm.
I watched this. I was going to say a little while ago in university, and then I realized university is over a decade ago for me at this point.
How dare you?
Yeah, so I watched this over a decade ago with some university friends who had never seen it. Was sitting down, and we specifically watched as close to this original cut as we could get. We had a huge debate about it. More on that later, potentially. But that ending scene, Han comes in, saves the day, so that Luke can blow up the Death Star. I was like getting misty eyed, and certainly some of that is because my introductory moment to Star Wars. I think I was 4 or 5 when I first watched these movies. Loved them, was obsessed with them, and of course, perfect time to become obsessed with them because then they get re-released a couple of years later. Yeah, the idea that there's a universal aspect to it. There's this idea of the movie pulls you in, takes you on a journey. It does start in medias res. Like we're right in the middle of the action. The princess's ship is boarded. After that incredible opening shot, you get the opening crawl. You get her ship cruising across the starlit
Yeah.
sky, the space, the emptiness of space, lit only by starlight. It looks incredible. And then this huge ship is just
Yes.
crawling over in pursuit of it, and it immediately illustrates the conflict that we just read about in that opening scroll. Opening scroll, we have the scrappy little rebel ship on the run, the huge Imperial ship giving chase. Those are the stakes right off the bat, and it really pulls you into this story, and you go on this journey with these characters, and we get to experience their individual heroes' journeys. Whether that's a more explicitly stated thing like Luke's, or a little more subtle like Han's. Droids go on their own little journey as well.
Yeah.
But circling back a little bit to what we were talking about with that referentiality, it's interesting because the hero's journey here gets kicked off by the droids.
Yeah.
R2 and 3PO are windows into this world. They are the kind of like stepping stone to get us into things before they become secondary. And that is just 100% stolen, in the best possible sense of the word, from an Akira Kurosawa movie. It was wild to me years after I'd first watched this movie, Star Wars, to go watch The Hidden Fortress by Akira Kurosawa. Because you're like, these two lowly samurai soldiers are R2-D2 and C-3PO. And they're getting caught up in this, here's this general that they're trying to get in touch with. Here's the princess that they are forced to help rescue. The parallels are really cool. Lucas is just paying direct homage to that. Structurally, it is basically the same movie, just without laser swords, magic, and space guns. We can't avoid that kind of referentiality. It gives structure, I think. It adds to the structure. It adds to that hero's journey that we're experiencing. This it adds to that plot, to that just power of pure narrative.
Yeah, there's it I did love the just to touch on the size, the sheer size and the visual representation of that conflict of like this massive Death Star compared to this itty bitty little rebel ship, which all practical effects, PS, how cool is that? But also the visual storytelling of size. And I'm going to deviate I'm going to be the one to deviate this time into other Star Wars media, that I was very taken aback by how small Darth Vader looked.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean that to say, in all the other films, I feel like he gets taller. He gets bigger. He gets more imposing. Like, you get the scene where he appears and everyone's like, oh my god, it's Darth Vader. And then in every other media, there's that moment where it's like a dark hallway and then suddenly red lightsaber. Yeah. And you're like, oh, snap. And then like his like his music intro became so iconic and all of these things. And so watching this movie, seeing that he's tall, don't get me wrong, all the evil people are tall, which means I am delightful. But he's not that tall. And that struck me as very interesting. And I don't know, it was weird to see, like, he is this very dark, imposing figure. He is, weirdly, I also found it so interesting that, like, he's this, that they drop all of this, like, the Force lore, throughout the film, and little hints of, like, he must be just like his father to Luke. And the uncle is like, I hope not. I truly... Spoilers. But if we're looking at this as, in the context of the movies that predate it and the way that we're visually storytelling, talk to me about Darth Vader. Because he's such a central part of all things Star Wars, but he's just kind of... I don't want to say he's just kind of there in this film, but, like, he's not the central focus as he is in so many other parts of this universe.
Yeah, he's just a heavy in this. He's kind of just... It's strange because he has such authority. We're shown that he has such authority. He's powerful. He's a scary guy. He's able to lift up that rebel officer by the neck. And I don't know if he's choking him or if he just snaps his neck. The sound effects could go either way. But he's able to just do that one-handed. He's shot to look a little more imposing than he might actually be. I just looked this up. The actor who portrays Vader in the suit was David Prowse. David Prowse is only 6'6". Is it only 6'6"?
Only 6'6".
He's 6.5 feet tall.
Cries in 4 foot or 3.
But by contrast, Peter Mayhew, who played Chewbacca, is 7'3". So, like, Vader's not even the tallest guy in Star Wars, but he's given such an imposing figure, and his mask kind of looks like a skull. It's got the kind of patterning going on there. In terms of, like, what this is necessarily referencing, I can't really point to one thing for Vader. I think he's an amalgamation of a bunch of different styles and inspirations, but he's kind of also his own thing. The most obvious things that inform Vader's appearance are probably samurai armor. So you've got the very stylized mask. The helmet that he has is a stylized take on samurai armor. So this is kind of, again, harkening back to Lucas's love of samurai movies, of Japanese cinema. And I think on that note, before I forget it, Obi-Wan's robes are basically, a kimono. I believe a kimono. There's a very sort of Japanese influence on his costuming. It's probably a better way to put it. Yeah.
I find it very funny that, like, most of the characters have very, like, stylized costuming.
Yeah.
They have these robes, they have these little crisscrossy things. Even as we get deeper into the lore and into the other films, it's like Rey's got all of those funny, like, little hair bumps and, like, the crisscrossy fabric and stuff for no reason. And then we've got Luke's aunt, who's in a 1970s jacket.
Yeah.
And I'm just like, where did the costumer forget her? It was weirdly jarring to see, like, all of these very, like I said, stylized, costumed folk, and then there's just this lady with, like, pointed collar. It's like, what happened?
Yeah. Like, Han has, like, pants, boots, and a shirt, and a vest, and that's it. Like, it's just the most... It's iconic because of who the character becomes in pop culture. But he's just kind of got an outfit. Luke's outfit is... I guess it's a tunic?
Yeah.
It's weird that Uncle Owen and Aunt Beru are basically just wearing, slightly stylized normal clothes, and Luke has, like, a tunic. Like he's in Legend of Zelda or something. He's gonna... But it makes sense. It makes sense. He's this hero. He gets his father's lightsaber. It's fun. It's interesting. And Gosh, there's so many things that I could just launch into right now. But I think we're talking we're talking around the hero's journey a bit here.
Yep.
And Luke gets his father's lightsaber. Luke learns that Darth Vader murdered his father.
Yep.
The second movie puts an entirely different twist on that, an entirely different spin on that. But if we're looking at it in the context of this movie alone, Luke never faces Vader one-on-one. He probably doesn't know that Vader's the guy who almost shoots him down in the Death Star trench run. Vader faces no consequences for anything he does in this movie other than maybe some mild nausea. He gets spun out of control. So it's interesting because there's a hero's journey here. Luke doesn't necessarily return to who he was, to where he was at the start. He continues on. And the end of this movie implies that they've won a battle, but not the war.
Right.
Which is kind of cool. So there's not necessarily a setup. I guess there is a setup for a sequel because Vader isn't accounted for in the ending. But, you know.
Yeah. I mean, in a world that predates this trend of like, but what if we made a sequel just in case it's, like, let's leave a couple loose threads just in case,
Yeah.
This movie ends very tidily, I thought. Like, compared to Jaws last time, right?
Oh, yeah.
Where Jaws is like, they swim into the sunset, or sunrise, I guess. This one actually has an ending. Like, I don't actually care about the other stuff, I'm not like, oh no, Ben, we must avenge him, or like, oh no, Darth Vader still exists. No, we blew up the Death Star, period, full stop. We did it. We did the thing that we went out to do. And it was very satisfying.
Yeah.
And I loved that for them. It felt like a good, satisfying 2 hours. I don't even know, because I didn't watch the clock.
Yeah, it again, it draws you in. I have that quote in our notes here from Roger Ebert, and we're probably going to come to it a little later on, but I think it's appropriate to bring it up now. His review in 1977 on watching this movie, he wrote, on whatever level, sometimes I'm not sure at all, sometimes I'm not at all sure, Star Wars engages me so immediately and powerfully that I lose my detachment, my analytical reserve. The movie's happening, and it's happening to me.
Yeah.
So this is one of those movies where it's like, it's got all these influences. We've talked a bunch about Kurosawa. There's, some direct shout-outs to Lawrence of Arabia by David Lean in here. There are, like, the entire Death Star trench run is almost shot for shot from a movie called The Dam Busters that came out in 1955, to the point where in the work print cut of Star Wars, when they were still finalizing effects, they're just like, here, we're going to splice in sequences from The Dam Busters. We're going to splice in actual World War II dogfight footage.
Wild.
So, it's drawing from these influences, but, it's drawing from all of this different stuff, putting it all together, and you don't really notice it. You're kind of just in it. You're along for the ride, and there's something really fun about that.
Yeah. It feels kind of like a love letter to all those things, but in space. Like, I don't... That's cool. I love that. Right? Yeah. Like, I love the idea of us as humans taking all these stories that mean the world to us and saying, oh, I like this piece and I love this piece and I'm going to play around with it and make it my own. And I think there's something really beautiful about that. Mm-hmm. And so when we talk about how popular Star Wars gets in a couple of minutes, this idea that Lucas just took a bunch of stuff that he loved and threw it in a box, shook it around, added a pinch of space. Yeah. And then there was Star Wars. Yeah. And it just, his love for all of these directors and all of these scenes and shots and all of this stuff really shines through. Mm-hmm. And I think that's very cool.
It's so cool. It's so fun. And I think it creates an incredible finished product. Mm-hmm. I think certainly in the time it caused a ton of stress. Getting this movie finished was tumultuous because of the effects, mm-hmm. because of challenges shooting, and because George Lucas's approach to direction was like, okay, and read what's on the page. and the actors would go like, but what's my context? What's the interiority to all of this?
Uh-huh.
I think Harrison Ford said, like, George, you can write this stuff, but you can't speak it. You write something out and it sounds great in your head and you read it out loud. Yeah. You're like, what am I saying? Yeah, it is such a love letter to those things. And it is very much George Lucas's influences on full display. But it's also such a team effort. He's the author of this story, but he's providing that big picture and everyone else is helping make sure it gets delivered to that level of quality. Again, that is a whole other... We could do a whole, like, 3 episode series on... We could do a trilogy.
Oh,
we could do a
God.
trilogy about Star Wars.
And then we do 6
Yeah.
prequel episodes
Yeah.
talking about all of the other stuff that came before it. Instead of that, although I
Yes.
think we are looking at Seven Samurai in a couple weeks,
Yeah.
I think that's a great kind of place to pivot to how it lets those characters shine.
Mm-hmm.
And we touched on it a little bit in that everybody is sort of getting their own hero. The fact that Luke is the main character, he's shown as this, like I said, scrappy little kid from this podunk little planet, and he goes on this grand adventure. But at the same time, we start with the droids. We start with Princess Leia. We, are introduced to this, gorgeous, like, rogue character later on and all these things. And as I was watching, it was really interesting to me that at no point did it feel like Luke was, like, he was a hero, but not the hero, And we see that a lot in modern films, I find. Like, you have the main character, period, full stop. And so often the other characters kind of are, like, there, and they don't necessarily get as much depth as the main. But the way that Lucas has set up this cast of characters to be a chorus rather than just, this one guy, I thought was really cool.
Yeah, I think you've got kind of like a power trio of main characters. I don't mean to erase Chewbacca from this. Chewbacca has no lines in English. Any dialogue he has, we rely on other people to translate for us. He's very secondary. Again, that's a whole thing we can get into. That's a whole other discussion. Yeah, the characters are they hew so closely to archetypes that we're probably already familiar with through the various stories that we've consumed in our lives, that we've seen elsewhere, that we've seen in other media. And the way that the story is structured, the way that they deliver exposition through that opening crawl really sets a stage for us and really lets us have these characters just kind of exist in this world, which is a really cool thing. And stands... It's part of why I really enjoy Star Wars, is that you get the sense that you're getting a glimpse into this universe, this galaxy far, far away at a certain time. We're seeing a snapshot of it. People still live here. People still exist here. The cantina scene, that huge panorama, all these different aliens, they're just hanging out. They're just hanging out, having a drink. They're doing whatever aliens do. And that, I think, is something that kind of lends to this lived-in world, and we're just catching up with these characters at this point in their lives. They're kind of not fully formed, but there's enough of a core there that we're able to really latch onto that, and the story lets them have their moments.
Yeah, nobody suffers because their peers have their moment. Like, in the first few shots when the boys rescue Leia, she takes Luke's gun and is just like, oh my god, you guys are useless. What are you doing? Shoots the thing and jumps down the garbage. And they're just like, what? Why are we rescuing her? She could rescue herself. What are you doing? Like, I'm starting to regret this already. And I'm just like, first of all, yes, Carrie Fisher. But also, they are not undermined by her. It's just building a dynamic.
Yeah.
And the chemistry between all three of them, not like sexual chemistry, just like chemistry, period, is so good.
Yeah.
Like, they just bounce off each other really well, even though sometimes the lines are a little clunky.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
Yeah, they click so fast.
yeah.
Just the I'm trying not to read these scenes with context from things that come before and come after, but
Yeah.
yeah, in those moments that they're in the cell block after they've rescued Leia,
Mm-hmm.
she is just like snarking at them as
Yes.
they try to rescue her. She dives into the garbage chute, and Han's going, "Oh, she's a wonderful girl."
Yeah.
What's his line? Uh, either I'm beginning to like her, or I hate her,
Yes.
or something like that.
Yes.
I can't tell if I
Yes.
hate her or I'm beginning to like her.
Mm-hmm.
His pure snark, and yeah, it's such a fun energy, and it's not meant. We are able to read into it chemistry, like beyond their immediate dynamic. We're able to read like romantic chemistry into that if we want, but it's fun that they kind of fall into these roles quickly. Luke is like the mediator between these two people in a sense, and when Han adds just such a sneer to every like honorific he gives her. It's like, oh, sorry, Your Highness, and then later on, it's like, look,
it
Your
just gets
Worship.
worse and worse.
Yeah, and it gets even better in. I mean, it gets so much better in the sequel. I love Empire Strikes Back. We're not talking about that now, but
we are not.
Oh gosh, this movie sets up so many wonderful things, but it's all here at the same time.
Yeah, I was struck by the scene where the TIE fighters, the ones that they're doing the run to try to blow up the Death Star, and Leia's at the table. Like, she's already being a general.
Yeah.
But we won't see that for another, how many movies? Right now, she's asterisk just a princess, but also she's this badass rebel. She's all of these wonderful things. And to have that depth, and I don't want to be too reductive here and say that movies in the 70s didn't make women powerful powerhouses and all these things, but she's kind of like, she's awesome.
Yeah.
Like, she isn't just the damsel in distress. She's like this super cool lady who can shoot and who can be a spy and all of this stuff, and who can not, give in to torture and all this stuff. And you're like, this chick is hardcore.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
It's so cool.
Well, and I was watching this with the context of the movie Rogue One. Came out, I think, 10 years ago now, but
oh god,
is technically maybe 9 years ago. I don't know. Is I'm doing math in my head and it's going wrong. It came out in the 2010s.
Yes.
And
oh god,
and it is chronologically immediately before the events of this movie, and the end of Rogue One really recontextualizes. At least at the time, I was like, oh, it recontextualizes the opening of A New Hope. But I'm watching A New Hope, and I think like, well, no, it doesn't. No, it's like, because everyone was talking about how end of Rogue One, Vader's like inches away from catching the Death Star plans, getting onto Leia's ship, and so that sets up the chase that they have at the start of this movie. But the start of this movie, there's the chase. They talk like we already see Leia has the plans. She uploads them to R2. Stormtroopers try and stun her. She just ices one of the stormtroopers out right away, no hesitation, before they knock her out. They bring her to Vader, and she's just like, I have no idea what you're talking about.
Yeah.
What do you?
These are
I don't
not
know.
The plans you're looking
yeah,
for.
I don't have the plans. This is ridiculous. You should let me go right away. And I remember thinking like, oh boy, like she's just lying to his face. She was always lying to his face. Like there's he knows. So it's all here. Again, all of this is here. The character is basically fully formed at this point. She's this scrappy princess. She is a military commander in this rebel uprising against the evil empire. It's great.
Yeah. I could wax poetic about Carrie Fisher all day long, so I'm not going to.
Yeah.
But I am going to pivot a little bit because you mentioned Darth Vader, and I feel like I want to talk about him, but not just him.
Mm-hmm.
the art form that is talking in masks. And
Yeah.
this is my small divergence here. There in a early life, in my college days, in one of my theater classes, we took a course on how hard it is to emote
Mhm.
in masks. Because you don't have any of that facial expression. You're just kind of moving your head in certain ways. And so throughout the film, as we're talking about letting characters shine, I think one thing that stood out to me really a lot was it's not just, our trio, even Vader, right? It's all of the other kind of side characters of R2D2 and C3PO had people in them. That
Mhm.
was wild. But also there's that scene, I think they're coming out of the trash,
Yeah.
maybe. At some point they walk through a room with all these different I know what it is. The scene where C3PO and R2D2 are kidnapped, effectively stolen, question mark? I don't know. And by the Jawas.
Yeah.
And you go through this big basement storage area of this ship, and you've got dozens of different robots, which kind of speaks to that greater world that you were talking about, right? That,
Mhm.
these are not just the only kinds of robot. Like, I recognize robots from other Star Wars properties that are like BFFs with characters, but again,
Yeah.
we're not talking about those. But all of them had such distinct emotions, even though they were literally just robots.
Yeah.
And I think, to your point, this brings everything so alive for
Mhm.
me. Like, even one of the robots, it was Wally. I was like, oh my God, the eyes of that robot, that's Wally. I just saw Wally in here.
Yeah.
Going ahead in time, this movie is referenced absolutely everywhere. But
Yeah.
again, it's a throwaway scene of C3PO's like, oh no, woe is me, life is terrible. And then he finds his BFF, his work wife, and they have their little moments of shining, and I think that's really cool. That even these machines, I don't even know how to talk about droids because they have emotions and feelings, and it feels wrong in this world of AI. I don't know,
Farrah,
but
it's so
it's
much to unpack. It's so much to unpack.
God,
They are sentient beings,
yeah,
and yet
I don't. It
we
makes
can't
me
get
feel
into it.
weird, and I don't like it. We can't. I can't. But yeah, anyway, so even the side characters, even the side characters, even the throwaway characters, like Jabba the Hutt has all these little people around him. So we get a glimpse of Jabba's empire.
Yeah.
And it's not even 2 minutes. And there's a Mandalorian there. And I think that's so to your point of, like I said, building this world, that gives us those glimpses that allow us to be like, oh, but what's going on over there? I want to see. I want to see what's behind that curtain. And I feel like we keep edging into the why it was this movie
Yeah.
to be that phenomenon that it is, which is how we're supposed to close this episode, but we're just dancing around it.
Yeah. It's so wild to me. We are recording this thing, and we're like, we've got this. We're going to talk about the referentiality. We're going to talk about all this, and we just kind of keep jumping off in different directions and trying to circle back around. And I love it.
Yeah.
But boy, it is tough to talk about this as someone who has, oh gosh, at this point, 3 decades of loving Star Wars.
Oh my gosh, yeah.
Yeah, it's tough.
So, okay, I think it's time that we touch on how the film has changed and evolved since it was released, so that we can finally make it into why it was this movie that was that phenomenon. So tell me about that, because like I said, I watched it once when I was 16, 17, and then the last 2 times have probably been the same version, maybe different from that first one because it was on VHS. I don't know. So tell me about those changes and why they were made.
Okay. So 1977 movie comes out. It's a smash hit. They re-release it just around the time, I think a year after The Empire Strikes Back comes out. They change the title of the movie to Star Wars A New Hope, and they add the episode 4
Uh-huh.
because now it sits in conversation, not in conversation. It is in a timeline with The Empire Strikes Back, and of course, The Empire Strikes Back ends with this cliffhanger, yada yada yada.
I'm going to stop you there.
Yeah.
Why? Okay, this screws me up every time because I'm like, I'm watching the first Star Wars, but I'm not watching the first Star Wars. I'm watching the fourth Star Wars. Why did they make the choice at that point to make it episode 4, not episode 1? Did they know they were making prequels?
I think there was a point where Lucas, it's tough because it's tough to really parse through, like a quote unquote official information about this, because so much of it has become filtered through like the official PR and storytelling of Lucasfilm and now Disney. There's such a reverence for, George's vision. It's all part of George's vision. But I think it's also worth noting that as much as Lucas had ideas for all this Star Wars stuff, I don't think it started to like really codify and solidify until A New Hope comes out. And then it really kicks into gear when he does Empire Strikes Back, because that's got, of course, we learn that Darth Vader is in actuality Anakin Skywalker, which implies this whole history,
Right.
whole other stuff. Leia's line in A New Hope about the Clone Wars, Obi-Wan Kenobi serving in the Clone Wars, becomes its own movie. It becomes a huge thing for the prequels. Yep. Lucas eventually decided he's going to do prequels, but I don't know when he decided to do that.
Right.
I think it's got to be when they start adding the episode subtitles to things.
Uh-huh.
These movies have changed so much, so much over the years, because the version I watched was Star Wars A New Hope Episode 4. And I watched that when I was 4 or 5 years old. That would have been, at the very latest, 1995. 2 years later, 1997, they re-release this original trilogy of films. They have cleaned up the picture. They have tweaked a few things visually to make it look nicer. They've also added back in some deleted scenes and made some new additions to extend things. So there's a huge Wikipedia article about all the specific changes. There are countless YouTube videos you can watch. The most contentious change, I can't remember if this happened in 1997 or when they came out on DVD in like 2004. But the scene where Han and Greedo encounter each other in the cantina, Han originally shoots Greedo first. I don't think Greedo even gets a shot off, or if he does, it's because he's like pulls the trigger as he is getting shot. They change it so that Greedo shoots first, somehow misses Han at point blank range, and then Han shoots him immediately after. They change the timing of that. Nowadays, watching it on Disney Plus, or even the Blu-ray version I have, I think, Han does this weird, his head moves, they've digitally moved his head to the side so that he dodges the shot.
Right.
Makes it even weirder. But the idea behind all these things is always, well, this is close to what George originally intended. This is how he wanted it to be. So I think part of it is kind of creating that sense of continuity from film to film to film. But I think part of it is also just his changing view of things. I watch Star Wars, and what I really enjoy about Han as a character is that he is this very, I'm in it for the money, I'm here for myself, I'm looking out for number one. But through the course of the movie, he changes, his character changes and develops. He becomes a little more open to his friends. He becomes more heroic. So I think
he goes kind of like from lawful neutral and his law being me.
Yeah.
To this like lawful good of like, okay, me, but also
and
people I love.
So I think that like things like that exist because it becomes this thing of like, well, we want to make the character's journey more obvious. I disagree with that a little bit in that instance. There are some additions and changes that are also contentious amongst fans. That one is the one that stands out the most to me, just because I find that their solution to it looks weird. It's a very jarring bit of digital trickery that they've done. Other things that are probably a little more noticeable are the things like when they are coming into Mos Eisley Spaceport on Luke's land speeder. It's an extended sequence. I think most of it becomes CGI. You can kind of tell that there are some people who have been taken from the original shots and composited in.
Mm.
It's a little wonky to me. I
Yeah.
think that part of it is like this idea of we have the technology to realize what we really wanted to do. Now
Mhm.
we're going to go back and we're going to tweak it and try and achieve that vision. Whether it
Yeah.
works or not is up to the individual.
Yeah, I remember commenting while we were watching yesterday that like, oh, that classic early CGI, and not like in a good way.
Yeah.
And I'm reminded of when, so I do visual arts as well because I have too many hobbies, and oftentimes I'll like finish a painting or a drawing or whatever, and then I'll go back and I'll like tweak it, and then I'll go back and I'll like tweak it, and then I'll go back and be like, eh. And then after like 10 different tries, I'm like, the first one was better. Why did I do that? And I had a couple moments watching it, like including that moment of like, oh, that CGI is a little
Yeah.
weird. Of like, you could have just left it. It would have been
Yeah.
fine.
Yeah.
But no.
Yeah. It's a little. Again, I think it's up to the individual how they feel
Yeah.
about that, but it's that question of like, well, when is something done?
Yeah.
And yes, George Lucas is the creator. He is the author of these things.
Mhm.
But does that mean that he has ownership over how we experience it?
Yeah.
Like our experiences of it are not necessarily. I'm getting at the idea of the death of the author. Once it's out there,
Yeah.
you know,
Yeah.
it's up to the audience to interpret it and experience it as they will.
Right. Yeah.
And if you're going back and you're making changes to that, that's going to change how an audience experiences it. But you can't
Yes, absolutely.
really control how the audience experiences it.
Mhm.
So,
Yeah, like you could have a VHS player
yeah.
and watch the old ones rather than the Disney Plus version.
Mhm.
And like I can only assume, and I suspect this will happen with you one day, that you'll introduce your kids to Star Wars, and had you a version on VHS or whatever from when you were a kid, that's probably the one you would have showed them.
Yeah.
But then they would go and they would watch it in college with their buddies, and it would be the Disney Plus version that, hey, maybe it's been changed 5 more times between now and then.
Yeah.
And they'd go, wait a minute.
Hang
And that
on.
really, like, that experience is so. I wonder how that has impacted the cultural relationship to these films too. Of just, I can't. Are there other movies that have done that? Because like I can't think of any.
I think.
And not just in Star Wars, just like
Yeah.
general statement.
Well, I think yes, there are some other movies that have kind of done this. Probably not to the extent that Star Wars has. I mean, you get things like the Zack Snyder cut of Justice
Right.
League is
Yeah.
functionally a completely different movie.
Yeah.
And the concept of a director's cut is nothing new. Ridley Scott. Oh gosh, actually, that's a really good point. Blade Runner. There are so many different cuts of Blade Runner. There's a version of Blade Runner that has Harrison Ford's character narrating like internal monologue for a significant amount of it, and no one wanted to do it. They only did it because they were forced to by the studio.
Yeah.
Subsequent releases, like definitive releases of it, cut that. I don't even know if it went to theaters that way, but it exists. You can find it if you know. But
If you know where to look.
yeah, if you know where to look. But also, another cool thing is that I remember I was in university taking a film studies class, and Blade Runner, the final cut, I think they called it, came out on Blu-ray, and it was like the Ridley Scott's. This is his idealized vision of the movie, but they also included like 2 different cuts. So like there was this at least acknowledgement of like what am I trying to say? There's this acknowledgement of the other versions of it, the other work
Right.
that other people might have a different preference, but this is his version of it.
Yeah.
That is
Versus-
not the case with Star Wars.
Yeah.
When they change it, all of Star Wars changes, and that's a little. I don't necessarily agree with that. There are things that I like that they've updated in terms of just the visual fidelity of it. Looks incredible.
Yeah.
But then they do some strange things that I'm not a huge fan of.
Yeah, and I think this is going to pivot us really nicely into why it's this movie, because each of those changes, like for us, I know Blade Runner has had sequels and stuff, but like Star Wars is such this magnum opus, this behemoth of cultural relevance.
Yeah.
And every time you kind of go back and rewrite history in a way, it changes that context. And so if we're looking at Star Wars now, we release ourselves from the just Star Wars A New Hope, and we dive in a little bit into Star Wars as this massive phenomenon
Yeah.
of, like, everything. It's all of the things, and how much people have grabbed onto it, you know?
Mhm.
Why this movie? Why was it this movie that went from, this scrappy little space opera to 12 movies, 6 TV shows, TTRPGs, books, music, cosplay up the yin yang, Wikipedia pages? Like, why? Why Star Wars?
I have no clue. I have no idea why this thing took off. There have been moments where I think I've asked my dad about his experience watching it when it came out. And I don't know that he recalls as much of a to do about this movie. But that also, maybe wasn't his interest at the time. I don't know that there's one thing I can point to in this movie, this franchise, that why it has grabbed attention the way it has. I think it was just it's such a spectacle, and it does call back to that kind of hero's journey, universal appeal that we were talking a little bit about. And my wonderful in my notes here, my wonderful uh, mathematical formula here, that is broad appeal plus awesome spectacle plus engaging story equals good times.
Yeah.
It might have just been the right thing at the right time and the right mix of factors. The special effects are incredible, but other movies had special effects. But I think that there's such a focus on them here, on really immersing people in this world and taking you along for the journey. I think it does have to boil down to that kind of immersion that you might get watching it in theaters for the first time.
Yeah, I can imagine how impactful that moment was when you first get into the theater and everything is dark, and then suddenly it's stars, and then suddenly it's this scroll, and then suddenly you're in space. And
Yeah.
like, in the 70s, how unique that
Yeah.
experience would be. But also, this harkening back to all of these different stories that were, if not directly familiar to these people, tangentially related. I can never say that word right. And every time I screw it up. And those stories are so simple. Like you said, it's not a complicated plot at this point.
Yeah.
It's not a complicated plot. And so, and they're such a unique and diverse, and I am not using diverse in terms of POC, I mean personality-wise. There is a very diverse cast of characters and a very populated world that, like, fan fiction is nothing new, right? But because we're given all of these different glimpses into different parts of the world, I feel like it's so easy for people to sort of look at it and say, oh, that part is for me. I like this part of it, and give me more of that. And then another person might go, oh, this part is cool. I want this thing. And like, I'm wondering if that's part of it. That diversity of character and that richness that he manages to build in the universe, despite only having 2 hours to do it in, strikes a lot of people as inspirational and exciting and new and novel and all these things.
Yeah, that is actually a really good point. I didn't really think about that, because now that you mentioned that, this is a movie that has, a dogfight in space, like an aerial dogfight in space, and a sick sword fight between two guys. What other movies are you going to get that in, if not Star Wars? There's a bit of everything in here, and it's fun. And you have characters that there's a character for everyone in a sense. There's someone
Yeah.
in this cast that people will relate to or be drawn to in a way.
You
Um,
have a whole D&D party.
yeah, yeah. Gosh, it's so fun.
I There's a line when we are at the war table with Vader and General Thorn. Is that right? No.
Oh,
No, he's a governor at this point.
he is
Something.
Grand Moff Tarkin, otherwise known as Governor Tarkin.
Right, yeah. And one of the guys before Vader, of course, like force chokes him, is like, ugh, you're from a different age, a bygone era, or, and then at some point, as like a, you suck.
Yeah.
Whereas, and Ben is like, or Obi-Wan is like, the lightsaber is a classic weapon from a bygone age, and all these things. And so, yeah, you get the classic sword fighting tropes of
Yeah.
like, haha, I will best you one on one. And it's not just like shooting at people from super far away, which gives you this like gamut of, again, there's something for everybody. And that's
Yeah.
really cool. Like, some people like dogfights, some people like
Yeah.
gunfights, some people like sword fights, and you get close combat and stuff like that.
Yeah.
Um,
There's even a bit of political intrigue there because there's
Yeah.
infighting at the war table in
Yeah.
the Death Star,
Mhm.
but they also have a line from Tarkin about the Emperor dissolving the Imperial Senate.
Yeah.
So they're doing the fascist playbook, but
Mhm.
it's just a tossed off line. But it
Yeah.
implies this wider world.
Yes.
That is, I think, not even wider world is not expansive. It implies that wider galaxy far, far away.
Yes.
It is. I love it for that. And
Yes.
yeah, the Obi-Wan's line of the lightsaber. I love that line too. It is an elegant weapon from a more civilized age.
Yes.
Not as
that's
clumsy or as random as a blaster. Uh, love that because it does imply so much. And his just kind of expositing to Luke about who Luke's father truly was
Yeah.
calls to mind the old Republic before it fell to the Empire, before the Jedi Order fell. They're not even an order; they're just the Jedi. There's just it's so evocative. I think it feels like such a weird way to describe it because there is so much Star Wars that has filled in all these gaps. But you watch this thing and it's just kind of throwing spaghetti at the wall and it's all
See what
sticking.
sticks.
Everything's
Yeah.
sticking.
Yeah, there's that moment the first few times where Luke gets like Obi-Wan in his head too, where it's like, okay, we're also talking about the afterlife? Question mark?
Yeah.
Psychic powers? Question mark? And like, again, there's a little something for everybody.
Yeah.
Like,
And
we've got our
oh,
yeah, our wizard is coming back to speak to his protege. Like,
yeah. And I think we mentioned this at the start. I love Star Wars despite Star Wars. I think that modern Star Wars is not always for me, and that's okay. You know, sometimes you have your relationship with something, and that relationship changes, and you put it away for a while. Maybe you come back to it. That's totally normal. We grow in and out of things, but I think that I am very much a person who I'm aware of the things now that Star Wars is more in conversation with, is referring to. And I find that modern Star Wars is in conversation with Star Wars. It's not necessarily drawing from that deeper well of references.
Yep.
But simultaneously, I'm aware of that. And then Star Wars will do a Star Wars thing. And I'll go, "Ah, damn it," while I am wiping the tears of joy from my eyes. And I love that about it. I have such a relationship with it, and that's okay. That's perfectly fine. It changes, it waxes and wanes.
It
Yeah.
harkens back to what we were saying before of Star Wars, because it has something for everybody. It also sometimes misses the mark for some people, while it hits the
Yeah.
mark for others. And I think that's really interesting if we think about how the fandom has evolved. And this is not something I think we have time to dive into, but the fact that there's the OG fans who watched it in theaters, the original version, who maybe
Yeah.
watched the Christmas special before it was banished and then brought back, and who memorize all of the stats,
Yeah.
And then, we start to add in diversity. And by that, I mean actual diversity, not just the different D&D classes, but actual diversity of stories. We have Ahsoka and a woman's journey in this world. We have people of color in this world, and we have different alien species, which even harkens to different stories, right? And not all of them are for everybody.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the greater Star Wars universe can support that diversity of stories is honestly really incredible, because I don't want to say that I will say that some producers might pander to a certain group of people, right? That's a thing. And a lot of people are often scared to, diversify. Like a certain mermaid. People were like, how dare you make this mermaid a person of color? And it was like, but it's a beautiful story. Why would you not?
Mm-hmm.
And Star Wars does it really well of okay, we're not going to change the culture of Luke, but we have an entire universe to play with.
Yeah.
Let's go do that.
Yeah.
And I just, it's so good. And it has kept its relevancy well because of that, I think.
Yeah. And, I think there's a whole lot to unpack there. George Lucas, just in the past week, had some comments about diversity in Star Wars. He's not against it.
Good comments?
They're not... I won't get into it too much. Suffice to say, some people are having some very weird responses to it. Lucas was talking about, there's so many aliens in Star Wars. It's like, well, yes, but they're not necessarily the focus of the story. I think that's a fair criticism. Anyways, that's as deep as I'm going to go right now, but it is this incredible setting, this incredible universe that has been created that has the potential that so many stories can now be told in it.
Yes.
That's amazing to me. And not all of those stories hit for me. When those stories don't hit for me, though, I guess what I'm trying to say is that my issue with Star Wars is that they should go for it more nowadays.
Yeah, I think what you were touching on of there's a difference between it's not written for me and it's not written well.
Yes.
And I can only imagine what it's like to be in a writer's room for a Star Wars intellectual property nowadays.
Oh, Lord.
And the stress that you are adding to this this incredible property. Because I think there's definitely room to continue to push that envelope of some of these stories just aren't for some people, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Building an immigrant's journey into a universe like Star Wars would be so easy, but it might not be for the, natural-born people in a certain region. I feel weird saying white men in America, but that's kind of the vibe we're going for, right?
Yeah.
And it's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay that's not for them.
Again, I am contractually obligated at this point to point out I am a 30-something white guy in Canada, but simultaneously the other contractual obligation I have right now is to say, have you watched the Star Wars television series Andor? Because it is incredible. Everyone should watch it and expand their understanding of what Star Wars can be. I'll stop there.
In that case, I think that's the perfect place to stop, to say closing statements. Star Wars, ? Feelings, and then the end.
Yeah.
As the scroll disappears into the void.
Oh, gosh. Closing statements. I love a good Star Wars. A good Star Wars. They're always going to sit in a certain place in my heart, I think. And like I was saying again, I think that the reference points for a lot of the modern Star Wars, at least on the film side, have been they're all going back to the same well. They're all going back to the Star Wars well. But when you get those things that are willing to be in conversation with more of a wider world. What is the line that Obi-Wan has? That's good. You've taken your first step into a larger world.
Yes.
Just take that first step, folks. Go for it. Create those. Pull a George. Take all your influences and mash them together and put it out there and see what happens. And I think that is an energy that this movie has that more people should have in what they create. Yeah. And I will always love it for that.
It really is that love letter that I kind of kicked us off with to all of these other mediums. And I do love it for that. And at the end of the day, the simplicity and I don't know if I would say masterful, but maybe storytelling and detail and just those sprinkles of world building I'm super into. And I think my last thought on Star Wars, the original, the OG, it's just a fun space romp, man. It's just fun. And that's it. That's, I'm not going to go and rewatch it 5 billion times to be like, that exact moment is where this happened, or like, I'm never going to recognize every character, but it's a fun romp, and it's a bunch of cool characters, and it's a really cool world, and I'm glad it exists,
Yeah, exactly. What a fun one.
Truly. And somehow we managed to do it in less than 2 hours. So Ben, where can where can people find you in the world?
People can still find me at my semi-active, nerdy Instagram account, Cafe Cartography. I really just paint models and put pictures of them on there. I am currently in the process of building out some other projects on my end, so hopefully more on that soon.
Gasp.
Farrah, where can folks find you?
I am on most of the socials as at Farrah Sarpkaya or Farrah Sarpkaya artwork, because I do a lot of stuff. And you can also find me at sarpkaya.ca if you're in need of a voice actor, which I am. And just, in the world. Gosh, Star Wars. All right. That was Star Wars, guys. What are we doing next week? I think we're going back in time. We are going back in time next week.
Well, really, if we posit that Star Wars is in a galaxy far, far away a long time ago, we might be going into the future, relatively speaking. Our past, Star Wars' future. We are going to go watch North by Northwest.
Ooh.
This is our first Hitchcock movie on our list.
Yes.
It's a fun one.
Yep.
It's a funny one. I love this movie, and I hope you do too. I hope you listening at home enjoy this one, and I can't wait to talk some more with you about it soon.
Amazing. All right. And we'll see you next week.